Before engaging with environmental issues, it's important to understand how we define, value, and expect action on environmental problems. Now we'll address some key divisions within environmental sociology: anthropocentrism and ecocentrism, the HEP-NEP distinction, the Realist Constructivist division, and the reformist and radical approaches to environmental problems. Firstly, anthropocentrism and ecocentrism are two ways of understanding an extension of ethics to nature. An anthropocentric perspective is to take a human-oriented view of the environment. In an anthropocentric ethic, nature deserves moral consideration because the ways in which we use natural resources affect humans. This is based in an ethical argument that what we should do with nature should be for the benefit of humans. So an anthropocentric ethic places humans at the centre of the world and other species and ecosystems as resources to be used by us, or for which we will care as stewards. An ecocentric perspective is a nature-centred view of the environment. In an ecocentric ethic, nature is not simply a resource for human use, but other species and ecosystems deserve moral consideration because they have their own intrinsic value. Consider an example: the conservation of elephants. We can understand that they're useful to people to haul logs from the forest, to ride into battle, or as attractions for tourists. However, if they roam into your garden and start destroying your crops, then they might be fair game and could be considered meat. In all of these scenarios, their existence is for the purposes of humans. We might worry when we see humans treating elephants poorly. However, if that concern is out of fear that humans will be next, then that is anthropocentrism. In contrast, if you've ever been close to an elephant and looked it in the eye, you would know that elephants are people too. You might see how it related to its family. Then you would readily recognise it as having its own value. This is easily understood by people who own pets. An animal serves a purpose for its human master, but it takes on its own value as the human grows and empathises. Some might sacrifice their own well-being for the sake of the non-human. When this extension of ethics looks not only to other species, but to whole ecosystems and the planet as having intrinsic value in the absence of humans, we're beginning to engage with ecocentrism. This ethical position can be extended to the planet and that humans do not have the right to threaten its integrity, either for us as individuals or to extend the human project. This leads us to the HEP-NEP distinction in environmental sociology. HEP refers to the human exemptionalist paradigm, and the NEP is the new ecological paradigm. The human exemptionalist paradigm is an extension of anthropocentric ethics. It emerged as a product of the era of Enlightenment and modernity. In Enlightenment thinking, humans were attributed a unique capacity for reasoning that allowed us to master science. We could harness the forces of nature to do things that no other species could. Humans are credited with an advanced capacity to reason, and so we could build great machines and technology that would lead us to new places in an age of exuberance. This expansionist perspective was built upon new advances in technology that allowed humans, particularly Europeans, to colonise new territories. Human exemptionalism meant that to do this, we needed to see ourselves as somewhat above other species. Other species were exempt from these advanced reasoning capacities. Of course, the age of exuberance reached some limits to growth. In the 1970s, we realised how much effort had been required just to get ourselves to the moon, let alone other galaxies. The limits to resource use were becoming apparent. A new ecological paradigm emerged in which people began confronting how to live in harmony on the planet and valuing the worth of other species and ecosystems for their own right. The environmental movement and its call for protection of other species and ecosystems emerged out of this new ecological paradigm. Yet how do we understand environmental problems to choose on which to act? This is where understanding the division between realist and constructivist approaches to environmental problems is useful. The realist approach argues that environmental problems can be understood objectively and are revealed to us by science, that they are real and exist outside of human consciousness and awareness. In contrast, a constructivist analysis highlights that our knowledge of environmental issues is itself socially produced, and to some extent, all environmental problems are constructed by humans. Looking firstly at the constructivist perspective, the implication is that our social environment affects the way that issues are perceived, and therefore these issues may not be direct reflections of reality. A constructivist analysis recognises that the construction of environmental problems could be infinitely ongoing. Even once we solve one issue, humans could simply reframe other less significant problems as now significant. Constructivists are not necessarily suggesting that we shouldn't respond to environmental problems. It means that a number of questions must be asked first. For an example such as soil erosion, consider the following questions. What's the history of the problem? Is the erosion something that is natural or unnatural? For who is it a problem and why? How does it compare to other problems? Are we hearing of this problem from beachfront homeowners affected by storms, from cattle farmers with eroding riverbanks, or from fisherfolk worried about muddy waters? Landforms, cattle, fish, or water do not speak for themselves. Who is making the claim of a problem or crisis? What other views exist, and what do they say about it? What evidence is presented that this is a problem? And are the potential solutions problems in other ways? What was once a way of treating erosion with the dumping of tyres and concrete is now considered an environmental problem. Many of the weeds and feral animals of today were once seen as improvements to the environment. Looking at the realist perspective, to understand an environmental problem properly and to put in place measures to address it, we need to know the scientific facts first. Plastics are building up in the oceans. Science tells us so. What method will clean this up? A realist perspective trusts that the science is real. The world's scientists tell us the problems. They use advanced instrumentation and comprehensive data collection to confirm these realities. A realist perspective accepts that the truth of environmental problems can be known by science, that they are problems for both humans and other species, and therefore the problems become ethical questions over how to respond. If it's agreed that response is necessary, then there are two broad calls made for change: the reformist and the radical responses. The reformist response is often also referred to as ecological modernisation or sustainable development. In this response, the problem is that society needs to adopt new technologies. We have been using outdated technologies that are part of the problem. These outdated technologies should be replaced in a process of reform of capitalism with regulation and incentives. The basic structures of capitalism, such as a growing economy, can stay in place, and introducing these new technologies will be part of economic growth. Incremental reforms are possible within this framework. A radical response argues that the problem is not a lack of technology. We already have abundant technology such as permaculture, organic farming, renewable energy generation, and writing. The problem is an obsession with certain forms of technology as a core function of expansionist industrialism and late capitalism. The problem is centred upon the structures of society. This model is linked to the ecological Marxism approach. It involves radical responses to capitalism. This might occur along individual lines, such as withdrawal from society into anti-consumerist self-sufficiency, primitivist experimentation, or rewilding experiences. Or it might occur along collective lines, such as replacing existing forms of ownership along the lines of decentralised and democratic control. This requires changing the political and economic systems. Are we all headed in that direction? Sociology can help us explain global responses to environmental problems.